Creating backend services can be a drag when you're primarily developing front-end applications. Firebase is a platform running as a backend service, covering areas such as Firestore for structured data, Google Cloud Storage for unstructured data, authentication for multiple providers, and functions as a service that can respond to HTTP requests or a number of events broadcasted from the previous mentioned services. By the end of this video, you'll have completed an Angular application that connects to Firestore for a real-time chat room experience using Angular Fire. To follow along in this video and receive the benefits of the generators shown, download the NX monorepo starter from the Gumroad link in the description. Run the client app and app feature workspace generators with the commands listed in the description under App Setup. This will create a client app, common library that will store models and validations, and a feature library that will contain our Chatroom componentry. Run the workspace generators in the description under models and validations. This will create a Chatroom, message, and member models and validations in the common project. The generator creates all the properties listed in the inputs parameter, but we'll need to modify the Chatroom and messages models. The default type for properties created are all strings, so no changes are needed for the member model class. In the Chatroom model, change the dateCreated property to a number. The lastMessage property stores a subset of information from the lastMessage, containing the message, data was created, and the username using TypeScript's pick class for the needed properties in the messages model and the member model. In the messages model, change the dateCreated property to a number. The user property stores a subset of member model properties to display in the list of messages of the chat room. Use the pick class with the member model to select the properties firstName, lastName, and username. Consuming Firestore requires an API key that is accessible for the web with references to the database for authorized domains, storage, and metrics. Create a Firebase config interface file and name the interface iABC data access config. Add an app name and a Firebase config property which mimics the web configuration properties from Firebase. Examining the data access module, the for root pattern is used to inject configuration services necessary for Firebase, including the Firebase app name and Firebase options. Angular Fire provides a number of services needed for consuming Firestore. In the ABC UI data access module, import the Angular Fire module and the Angular Firestore module enabling persistence. For our environment file in the Members app, I'm a proponent of having an interface for its configuration. This way, TypeScript will enforce the contract of the interface, ensuring properties are implemented on compilation. Create an interface in the app with a property data access config that is of type iABC data access config. Open the environment file and cast the environment variable to be of type iABC members app config. Add the property data access config. Open your Firestore project and find the web configuration. The values listed here are used to connect to Firestore, metrics, and storage. Copy the configuration values into the environment file for the data access config property. Import the ABC UI data access module using the for root method into the app module. Use the environment file's data access property in the for root method to inject the Firebase configuration. Head back over to Firestore and add C data for the members and Chatroom collections. After creating a Chatroom document, create a subcollection for messages following the model properties we created earlier. Note that if you're creating a new application, the rules need to be configured to allow reading and writing to documents. If you'd like me to go more in depth on Firebase rules, please leave me a comment below. Create the services listed in the description under Services Generator commands. In the ABC UI Data Access Projects Services folder, add an index TypeScript file and export the services created. Then update the index TypeScript file at the source level with the exported services. Opening the Chatroom service, the goal is to retrieve all the documents in the chat rooms available for the user to select. Inject the Angular Firestore service and create a Chatroom's property. The Chatroom's property creates an observable of Angular Firestore collection that returns all of the documents for the Chatroom collection. The return value is a query snapshot of Chatroom documents, so in the map function, it transforms the snapshot into an array of Chatroom models. The members service retrieves a list of members in the same manner as the chat rooms. In this instance, knowing the current member requires to set the current username. Like the chat room example, inject the Angular Firestore service and create a members property to retrieve all the members. Create another private property named username, which will be of behavior subject string. Then create a method setCurrentMember with a parameter for username. This will be able to set the next value in the behavior subject for username. Please note, I don't recommend this way for retrieving your members. The more appropriate way would be to use Firebase Authentication and map the user ID to the current user. Leave me a comment below if you'd like me to cover Firebase Authentication. Finally, create another property of current member, which will be used to change the current member based on the next value emitted from the username property. This will use the members property to find the member using the username emitted. The messages service allows for real-time communication for those subscribed to a particular room ID. As with the other services, inject the Angular Firestore service. Create a method getRoomMessages with a room ID parameter. The return value for getRoomMessages will be of type record string message model. The collection path is dynamic as the room changes. Remember, messages are a sub-collection of the chat room. In the query, limit the number of records returned in order by the date created. In the previous services, a promise returned a query of the collection using a get method. This time, state changes creates a snapshot listener returning document state changes along with the document changes. These state changes are either added, removed, or modified. Transform the array of the document change actions returned from the query to an object in a map operator. To do this, use reduce on the array and transform the document action to a messages model. The object returned for reduce method uses an ID of messages model as a dictionary key and set the value to the messages model. Making sure previous messages display in the chat, the scan method accumulates values the same way the reduce function on an array works. In this case, the spreader operator ensures unique values for the messages in the chat. Finally, create a sendMessage method, which will add a document to the messages collection using a room ID and the message to be added to the collection. Create the components listed in the description under Components Generator commands. The chat room list will display a list of chat rooms for the user to choose, and the chat room component allows users to communicate with one another. In the NxWelcome component of the ABC Members app project, modify the markup to contain a router outlet. In the app module, create a routes variable that will redirect with an empty path for the NxWelcome component. Then add children that will lazy load the ABC UI members feature. Add these to the router module for root. Head back over to the ABC members feature library and open the ABC UI members feature module. Add a routes variable. The first route will include the path chatroom and a component chatroom list component. Next, add a children property to the chatroom route. Add a child route that contains a path chatroom ID parameter, which will be used to read the selected chatroom. Set the component property to be the chatroom component. When a user enters this module, the final route added will redirect the user to the chatroom route. Add an empty path and a redirect to with the value chatroom and a path match of full. Finally, import the router module with the forChild method and include the routes variable. Open the chatroom list component and inject the chatroom service and member service. Create a property chatrooms and set it to the chatroom service property chatrooms. Add another property member and set it to the member service current member property. If the current member doesn't exist, a login mechanism allows the user to log into the chat room. Create a form control for the username and add a method setCurrentMember. This will read the username from the form control and call the setCurrentMember method on the member service. Open the markup. This will be a simple list of chat rooms that will redirect to a specific chat room through an unordered list. Use the ng-for directive to iterate through the list of chat rooms. To navigate to a specific chat room, the anchor tag binds a router link directive with the chat room ID. Add a text box that binds to the form control directive to username. Add a keyUpEnter event that calls setCurrentMember. Finally, create a login button that binds to the click event that also calls setCurrentMember. Wrap the input and button in an ng container. Add an ngIf directive checking if the current member is undefined. Finally, add a router outlet that only displays if the current member exists. The Chatroom component injects a few different services. It injects the Chatroom service, messages service, member service, and the activated route. In this instance, the activated route contains a route parameter for the Chatroom ID. Add a property, current room ID, that reads from the activated route's params property. Create a Chatroom property that reads the stream from the current room ID. Use switch map to cancel the previous stream the component subscribed to and return an observable of the chat rooms from the Chatroom service, and then filter by the Chatroom ID. Another property, messages, will also read from the current room ID. Using switch map again, the inner stream uses the message service to retrieve a room's messages from the room ID. Recall that from earlier, the return type of the messages is a record string of message model, so the object values will transform the value into an array of messages model. Create a member property and set it to the current member from the member service. To send messages, create a form control named messages. Generate a method with a signature of the room ID and user. First, we want to make sure that the message has a value. If it does, disable the form control. Next, the message service sendMessage method accepts a room ID and the message model, which uses the message property value and the member information. After waiting for the promise to resolve, we set the message and enable the form control. In the Chatroom template, create a div with ngIf directive that creates an object with properties Chatroom and member. Each of these properties are set to the respective properties of the component, Chatroom and member, with an async pipe to subscribe to changes. Finally, alias the object to room. Create a scrollable div that contains all the messages for the room. Create an unordered list within the scrollable div and the list items which within it that renders the messages within the messages property of the component. Finally, add a text box and a button. This will be used to send messages between users. The sendMessage event needs to know the room ID and the current user. These will be parameters for the sendMessage method. Bind a keyUp_enter event to send messages on the text input, and create a click event for the button that also binds the send message. Now serve your application using the npx NgServe-ABC members app. Open two different browsers, then click on Chatroom 1 and log in with members from the member collection. Start typing messages into the enter message text box in either browser, and the messages will appear in the scrollable div once you click enter. In this video, you learned how to create a real-time chat application using Angular and Firebase. You learned how to configure an Angular application with Angular Fire, retrieve Firebase settings for web applications, and create collections within Firebase for consumption. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe and check out NgServe-io, where we serve the Angular and web development communities.